I've been following Canadians for Tax Fairness for I can't even remember when I started following the work. And Erika today is going to talk to us about taxes and the path to a green economy. Erika is the communications coordinator at Canadians for Tax Fairness, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that advocates for fair and progressive tax policies, aimed at building a strong and sustainable economy, reducing inequalities, and funding quality public services. You are totally in our wheelhouse, and we are so honored to have you here today. I will hand it over to you, and thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much. As Kathy mentioned, Canadians for Tax Fairness is a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2011 by a broad coalition of civil society organizations, unions, international development organizations, economists, researchers, and we're united by the desire to steer Canadian tax policy towards addressing social, economic, and environmental challenges. Some of the campaigns that we work on: corporations pay your fair share, so ensuring that corporations are paying their fair share of taxes, tackle tax havens, so trying to limit and ideally eliminate the use of lower tax jurisdictions, which allow people to avoid paying tax. Polluters pay, so those who have contributed to the climate change crisis should be the ones paying. Close tax loopholes, similar to corporations paying your fair share, tax loopholes for the rich and tax loopholes for corporations. And snow washing, which is a corporate transparency campaign, and tax the rich. And we recently, just today, put out a report that pretty well touches on all of those campaigns. And I thought that maybe the best way to sort of speak about taxes and climate change is to walk through some of the main findings of our report. So our report found that the tax system is basically preventing the government from meeting climate and equality commitments. And we need to fundamentally change our tax system if we're going to address these crises. So one of the first things that we started looking at was the cost of inaction. And estimates range, but our report found that at least $25 billion in national income could be lost annually by 2025. And that jumps even higher to 2055. Low income earners in particular, we know, face a disproportionate effects of climate change, and they could see losses of 5 to 7% by 2055. But proactive investment could generate economic returns. Here are some of the breakdowns of how much spending is required, and it's a lot. To put it in context, it's actually less than what was spent on the COVID pandemic, less than what was spent during World War II. And we feel that climate change is on a similar level as those events, and we can't afford not to act. And the government's spending on climate action really needs to be thoughtfully managed. And here's where we sort of lay out what's at risk in the government's current approach to combating climate change. But first, we'll look at who should pay. And we propose that the distribution of costs should account for the roles that individuals and corporations have played in creating the climate crisis and the contributions that each one's capable of making. The other main point that our report came to is that income and wealth inequality is a twin crisis of climate change. The government can't address one of these without addressing the other. And here's a really jaw-dropping statistic that we found in our report. So the change in emissions, while the bottom 90% reduced their emissions since 1990 by 4 tons per person, the top 1% increased them by 34 tons. So we know that the rich are contributing far more to higher emissions. Globally, we've seen these statistics before. Globally, we see a similar breakdown, responsibility for high emissions falling on the highest income individuals. And then wealthy individuals also benefit from climate change through the distributive impact of fossil fuel corporations passing down their profits to shareholders. And fossil fuel corporations were 5 of the 10 largest non-financial distributors of profits to shareholders, with wealthy individuals receiving an outsized portion. So in other words, the highest emitting corporations paid out billions to the highest emitting individuals. Workers are not receiving a fair share of those profits. This is a graph from our report showing that the fossil fuel sectors have claimed 1.61 in operating profits for every dollar paid to labor, more than any other non-financial corporations. And we see how this breaks down as our carbon-intensive economy has, over the years, rewarded the biggest contributors to climate change and worsened our inequality crisis. We can see that wealth inequality is even worse than income inequality, and the top 10% has more than 60 times the wealth of the average wealth of those in the bottom half. So to sort of sum up, a small minority of individuals have increased and concentrated their wealth because of our carbon-intensive economy. They're outsized contributors to emissions. Their wealth and power enables them greater adaptability, mobility, and protection from the negative impacts of climate change and the just transition. Under our current system, those who are primarily responsible for the crisis will bear the least costs. The other thing we looked at was the corporate contributors to historical emissions, and these are consistently oil and gas corporations, far exceeding emissions of other sectors. And these fossil fuel sectors are also among the most profitable companies in Canada. They're some of the biggest, most powerful, most profitable companies, corporations, in this sector. They've had some of the highest profits among non-financial corporations for at least the past decade, or close to the past decade. Again, to summarize, we're seeing increased corporate concentration, increased profit, increased wealth inequality. And there's a number of ways in which our tax system just makes this even worse. So a number of tax deductions benefit the wealthiest Canadians. The capital gains exclusion deduction, where workers are taxed fully on the income that they make, but only half of capital gains is taxed. That's a benefit that primarily benefits the top 10% of earners. Almost 3/4 of tax credits went to the top 10% of tax filers. And we see similar tax breaks for the largest corporate emitters. Fossil fuel corporations have claimed outsized shares of capital consumption allowances. I'll get to that in a second. They've also claimed over $20 billion in tax credits since 2010. And the capital gains exclusion applies to corporations as well, which has saved them, the oil and gas sector, more than $4 billion. So capital cost allowances allow corporations to deduct the assumed annual cost of depreciation from assets such as machinery and computing. And since 2000, the public has paid $20 billion through overly generous CCAs to subsidize fossil fuel investment. And a lot of the reasoning behind these kinds of deductions for corporations is to encourage them to reduce emissions. But as we see, the fossil fuel sector emissions intensity was 27% higher in the second half of the 2010s than in the first half. Now, the government's current action continues to use taxes as part of its climate action. Its latest budget commits more than $65 billion in tax credits to encourage industry, to encourage industrial transformation. We have the carbon pricing system, the fuel levy, and the output-based pricing system, which allows free tradable allowances and reduced price for large emitters. And these are some of the many tax credits in the government's climate action, and it's a lot of money. Tax credits have all allowed the oil and gas sector to reduce its taxes by almost 40%. There are many other options that governments can pursue while using the tax system that do not disproportionately benefit, as to the same degree, corporations and the wealthy. One interesting approach in the US Inflation Reduction Act is that the government has brought in a minimum tax on book profits, which sort of puts a floor on how much tax corporations can avoid. This is an important revenue driver for the Inflation Act's investments in the green economy. And it also acknowledges that it is the biggest corporations that stand to benefit from spending. In 2020, the EU European Green Deal includes a broad set of tax reforms, such as removing subsidies for fossil fuels and shifting the tax burden from labor to pollution. And one of Canada's major tax expenditures is the provision of an investment tax credit for R&D, but oil and gas extraction companies have claimed a large share of this expenditure, whereas in other countries such as Italy and Portugal, they've updated their tax incentives to preferentially support ecologically oriented projects. Another example of innovative use of taxes is the EU's plastics tax. Others have argued that taxes on luxury goods should have a higher carbon tax. Targeting luxury goods would be one way to deal with the sized role that wealthy individuals have played. And another idea could be a progressive tax on aviation. So there's plenty of ways in which the Canadian government can use the tax system to combat climate change that are more redistributive. And that brings us to what we recommend the federal government do going forward with its climate action plan. Without the necessary tax measures and stronger conditions around the government spending, we see their climate spending as potentially exacerbating inequality. So we have recommended a number of policy measures that would address historical inequality and inequality going forward. One of those would be to bring in a wealth tax and to fully tax capital gains. To not only these two substantial measures could bring in a substantial amount of money, up to 50 billion annually, which would be a significant revenue driver for investments, while also acknowledging the role wealthy individuals and corporations have played. A windfall profits tax is another measure. A progressive corporate income tax rate. So the personal income tax rate is progressive, but the corporate income tax rate is flat. So the biggest, most profitable, highest emitting corporations are taxed at the same rate as smaller, less profitable ones. Adding progressivity to the corporate income tax could address this climate context. Stronger conditions for tax credits, including labor requirements and proof that emissions are reducing. Advanced credit funds for nonprofits, strengthening the carbon pricing system to phase out free allowances and follow the lead of the EU, and fairly taxing carbon content on imports and exports. More aggressive elimination of subsidies. The government's been saying that they are going to eliminate subsidies, but we need them to move faster. We need them to be clear about which ones. Alongside this, just providing more tax sticks instead of just tax carrots. So more than just incentives, but strong deterrence and punishments. We do have a petition on our website if you'd like to sign it, calling on the government to reform the tax system in order to meet our climate and inequality goals. If I would encourage you to go sign it. And our report is available on our website. It's a 55-page report, but we also have a nice summary of just 10 pages that's nicely designed if you want to take a look at that with some graphics.
And, I just want to say thank you for coming in. And you and I seem to have the same thing in our throat. And so everybody knows it's not COVID. And I've been saying that all the time.
Yeah.
So thank you for, coming in.
Hello. I was just going to ask, I mean, of course, Citizens Climate Lobby, we're like really huge on the carbon tax. Or carbon fee and dividend actually is correct. It's not a tax. Anyway, so just wanted to ask the question: how do we collaborate a little bit more and form a stronger community bond with you and your group, so that, because I mean our goals are so aligned. So anyway, that's the question is, hey, let's hang out. I don't know. What do you think?
I think one of the ways that people can get involved is, if you're not already, subscribe to our newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter with some of our campaigns, updates on tax fairness news. And then more broadly, I think I think there's a real, I agree that I think there's a real room for organizations who are very much on the same page and wanting to achieve the same goals to work more together. We know that that the anti-tax and the anti-climate action people are very good at coordinating and sharing their messages. And I think there's a real need for progressives to have a stronger network. I don't know if I have any sort of immediate solutions right now in terms of how we can do that, but I think that we just had a board meeting a while ago and we were talking about the upcoming election and or sorry, the potential of an election, and how that could really be something where progressives can unite, mobilize on advancing some of our key issues. But I think if there are ever any conferences or other ways for our organizations to get together, that's great. And we are a small org and we're in different sort of parts of Canada, but
Yeah, that's a great answer. And that was a great question, Vince. For everybody, I put taxfairness.ca website in the chat. I've been following it for a very long time. I think since almost the very beginnings in 2011. And as for working together, I mean, everybody, please circle the date, June 2nd to June the 4th. We're coming back to Parliament Hill and going to have an all-out conference like we used to, with lots of guest speakers and lots of hobnobbing. And we hope to build a giant dream catcher on Parliament Hill. So it'll be just as much about getting progressives all in the room and getting our volunteers with them. So I hope you can join us again. I'm sure that there are other questions out there.
Thanks. That was really quite insightful, and the degree of inequality and how it's being exacerbated was really news to me. And you came up with quite a number of tax initiatives that could address some of that, but I was a bit overwhelmed by the number of them. Is there one or two that you would promote as being particularly effective or particularly important, and we might even be able to drop into lobbying that we do?
Yeah, that's a great question, because when we were putting out this report, that was one of the questions that we had looking around the messaging. There's so much in it. How do we prioritize? And what we decided was that I think, just given the scale of inequality and how obviously it is linked to the climate crisis, those three tax measures at the beginning of a windfall tax, a wealth tax, and fully taxing capital gains would be our priorities. And ending fossil fuel subsidies would probably be a close. It's hard to say. We debated a lot over which ones to prioritize, but those are definitely the four, I think, that stand out.
That was a great question, Doug. The government released new rules for inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Does your report include that, like, because they've updated them this summer? I was wondering if that's in there. It just came out this morning. I didn't have time to read it, so
I'm not sure if we have. So this was written by our economist, and I've had a pretty big role in sort of the comms and messaging around it, but I do know that some of the expert panels on our report panel had noted in the summer that the government was coming out. So it is possible that we have. I can take a look and find out.
okay, thanks. And just for, if your side wants to know, we are asking for those loopholes within the carbon pricing policy to be removed, like the free allowances and the much lower tax rate for fossil fuel energy to be increased. And also, we're really pushing to get methane powered electricity out of the output-based carbon pricing system. If you don't remember that, that's okay. And we also push for carbon border adjustment mechanisms.
So my question, well, I kind of have two questions, but I'll combine them into one. Like, is there an appetite right now in any of our political parties to review for tax reform, but particularly as how it can relate to us tackling the climate crisis that we have? I'm interested in how to relate. How to highlight that coming into the next election. And that's the second part of my question is tax fairness strategizing in preparation for the next election?
Yeah. Those good questions. I think there is an appetite. At the NDP's convention just this weekend, there's a resolution for a wealth tax, for increased corporate income tax, and for measures that would tax corporations that pay a disproportionate amount to their CEO compared to their average worker. So these are great to see. And the NDP has been very supportive of many of the tax fairness measures that we've recommended. The Liberal government, in fairness to them, has made some commitments to tax extreme inequality. They brought in some measures to add some progressivity to the tax system, but it hasn't gone anywhere near enough. And from our discussions, we don't think that there's a particular appetite, especially right now, to campaign on tax fairness measures, which I guess brings us to the election. We had a really interesting discussion at our board meeting about the narrative right now among conservatives and anti-tax organizations like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, the Fraser Institute, that are really linking the affordability crisis to the carbon tax and to taxes in general. Even Trudeau's, sort of threat that if grocery chains didn't get their prices under control, we might bring in some tax measures. Even Pierre Poilievre was able to campaign on that as a tax on food, as if the government was going to add a tax to what Canadians are paying. And we know that it's resonating from the polling that we're seeing. So we think there really needs to be a much stronger campaign around that narrative, a campaign that shows what we get back from our taxes, that corporate profits don't help the economy. Taxes do, and taxes can make life more affordable for Canadians. One thing that we all agreed on was that it will be a real challenge because a lot of these organizations have a lot of money and they have a lot of media reach in today's media landscape. And so it will be a challenge, but I think those are some of the key messages that we'll need to focus on in the election.
Well, I think that's it. And I love it when things end early on Zoom because that gives us five less minutes to, be Zooming, which is great. Erika, this was a fantastic presentation. I know for sure that our organization, Citizens Climate Lobby Canada, is going to take this materials and many of our volunteers will absorb it. And I really hope that in June, you will come to our big event on Parliament Hill when there isn't a threat of COVID and the flu and bad colds circulating around. And this will be wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Please.
Thanks, everybody.